One thing I have found is that the board of directors is a universal global currency. If I go to Dubai, if I go to Beijing, if I go to Singapore, New York, London, wherever you go, if you say the term board of directors in a company context, everyone immediately knows what you're talking about. Now remember, this is a very rough and ready way of doing things, and they were not spending a lot of money on unnecessary items. So if you want to have a meeting of these 10 or 12 squires who are investing in the enterprise, how do you do that? How do you put together such a corporation? You can't get everyone together at a tea house or an ale house to sit in a back room and go over everything, because what you're doing is quite confidential business information. You need a place to withdraw and look over all these accounts on a regular basis. Company headquarters. Remember, we're talking about down at the wharf or a warehouse or a manufacturing, something like that. And at this time, about the only thing that looked like a regular office facility there may have been one fellow sitting at a high table with a high stool, going over the Scrivener books, keeping records and things. A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge, Bob Cratchit sitting there, huddled over the candle, warming his hands and scribbling down with his quill pen to make the accounts for the day. That was the only office staff and office facility you had, typically, for something like this. So it's not a very good operation for having a meeting of all the investors. What do? You get everyone together. The first thing you do is, because as we mentioned here, there's still just that little office and you have the books and the papers there, so that's where you're likely to convene. Get our squires together. Well, what do we do from here? How do we lay out all of our paperwork and our accounts and gather around and have a proper meeting? It's at a warehouse, a barn, something like this. There's some various types of junk sitting around. There's a plank leaning up against the wall. Grab a 3-yon plank, bring it over here, we'll lay it on top of some barrels, and we'll come spread our papers on that, and all gather around our plank and have at least some sort of a meeting of the investors of the enterprise. That's one of the marvels of the English language. Things that are completely out of nowhere end up becoming symbolic and taking on meaning. The same thing happened in this case, because this group, this assembled ownership of the enterprise, took their name from that plank that they were gathered around, except we don't call them a plank of directors today. We use another term, a board, as in a board of directors. So we end up with furniture giving all of this wonderful corporate model that we have its name. So that is the scariest part. We have a boardroom model that in many ways is an anachronism, is wholly outmatched by the designs, the demands of modern commerce and business. That is why we are here today, because that board model is depending on each one of you to help them through this situation, to be the expert on it. The board of directors, corporate governance, is something that is designed for another era and is trying to drag itself into a new era. You are the people who are doing much of the dragging. Chairmen of the board are tied up with a lot of major issues. Someone else has to get things working. Someone else has to make sure the board runs efficiently, that the information is usable, is on time, that the procedures used by the board are effective, that the materials they have, that the meetings are working well, all of these things that tend to be dismissed in discussions of big corporate governance issues. The small things of boardsmanship, how the board meets, its information, its facilities, all of these things are in your hands, and they're absolutely vital to trying to keep this poor old model of corporate governance effective in the 21st century? Are there people who have been nominated to your board that you, at least privately, have said, why is that person here? What qualifications do they have? Is this an issue? I see some people nodding heads, and if you don't want to name names, obviously you're not expected to. And that's a good point here, because knowing all of these proper things about qualification and independence are good, but particularly in state-owned entities, you will want someone on the board who has those political connections, and that makes them valuable. So yeah, maybe the fellow didn't know much about airplanes and was running the Civil Aviation Board, but he's tied in with the state ministry and we depend on. So yeah, he has value on our board of directors.
So you'll not necessarily get the skill set that you require, but these will be political appointees. So sometimes it's a challenge when it comes to the board committees. Mm-hmm. You will find that the independents will be the chairs, but not necessarily have the, for example, financial background you need to chair the audit committee, but you've got to, work with them because just that's how the appointing is done.
And you made a wonderful point there, because if you have a board of directors who hasn't those skills, who is the burden going to fall upon to try to develop them, to try to educate them? You, the company secretary's office, the staff. Suddenly, instead of being people who are watched over above, governing you and the job you're doing, you're having to be tutors. Right. Have any of you held that situation? I'm the one who's got to try to educate the board on how I do my job. I'm the one who's having to bring them up to speed on what I do. And it puts an enormous burden on the company secretary and administrative staff. Yes. But that ties also into the fact that so many of the private companies are also family-held and family-related companies, and that gets into the succession planning issues. And I'll go into that a little bit later, but that's where independence comes in. If for no other reason than the family has to say, do we want the company to survive to the next generation, to the third generation? Are we going to be able to develop that? Here's something I'm going to mention in more detail later, but it's a rule to put away for now, and that is that in a family-related company, it's easier to upgrade the governance and oversight skills of members of the family than it is to get all independent members on the board who have those skills from the outside. Everything is very well professionalized nowadays. Management is a profession, has been for decades now. One thing that isn't a profession is leadership of the board. You may become chair of the board because you have a very impressive resume and vitae. You may become chair, as we mentioned a few minutes ago here, because of political or representation conditions, things like that. There are any number of reasons why you become chair of the board. One thing that no one demands of the chair of the board is that they actually have chairmanship skills and expertise. What's missing from this in your experience? What more do you want to see?
Compliance
A report from the compliance department, particular maybe legal issues or anything and that particularly could be a value depending on industry as well. As you mentioned, your legal related, finance related, that could be an extremely important item. Shareholders sued the company saying the board had made a very poor job of reviewing this, that they simply did not review why this was a bad acquisition, waved the deal through, everything was fine, and that was the end of it. No one raised any questions. The board, obviously the company tried to say, no, we made a good point of it here. Everyone was on board. The board looked at the information, carefully reviewed it, and was unanimously supportive of making this deal. It was a good thing in our business judgment. someone on the plaintiff side managed to get a hold of one of the board minute books from one of the directors, which had one of his handwritten notes in it. And on the margin next to the agenda item for discussion of possible merger, in his handwriting was a little note that said, "Who came up with this stupid idea?" The piece sort of fell apart right after that. So the point is that aside from the confidentiality of the director's information, whatever scribbles directors are making on the notes ends up being legally discoverable and can come back and bite you. So the importance of impressing that on the directors, anything that they touch generally can have some liability